The tension in the federal congressional hearing room was electric. Judge Samuel Alito sat at the witness table, his black robes draped behind him, a slight smirk on his weathered face. He had just dismissed Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's question about judicial ethics with a wave, as if swatting away an annoying fly. "Congresswoman," he said condescendingly, "perhaps you should focus on issues you actually understand." The room fell silent. Liberal lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. Conservative members leaned back with satisfied grins. Alito's smirk widened, believing he had just put the young black congresswoman from Texas in her place. But what happened next would change everything. Jasmine Crockett slowly stood up, her burgundy blazer perfectly pressed, natural hair in an elegant twist. Her dark eyes locked onto Alito's with laser intensity. The slight tremor in her voice was gone, replaced by something that made seasoned politicians take notice. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying across the silent chamber, "I think it's time we talked about what I actually understand. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss moments like this when justice meets its match. Now, let's see how a first-term congresswoman turned the tables on one of America's most powerful judges." The packed hearing room suddenly felt like a boxing ring. Alito, at 74, had spent decades on the highest court, accustomed to deference and reverence. He had testified before Congress multiple times, always maintaining composure, always controlling the narrative. Crockett, at 43, was relatively new to Washington's power games, but she had cut her teeth as a civil rights lawyer in Dallas, defending people who couldn't defend themselves. Every instinct developed in Texas courtrooms told her this moment was her chance to make history. The smirk on Alito's face began to fade as he noticed something in Crockett's posture that suggested this wasn't going his way. The murmur from the gallery died completely. Even court reporters stopped typing. This wasn't just another routine congressional hearing anymore. This was about to become a defining moment that would be replayed on news programs for weeks, shared millions of times on social media, and remembered as the day a young congresswoman reminded a powerful judge that in America, no one is above accountability. To understand what was about to unfold, you need to know exactly who these two people are and why this confrontation mattered to millions of Americans. At 74, Samuel Alito represented the old guard judicial system. Nearly 2 decades on the Supreme Court, shaping landmark rulings. Princeton and Yale educated, he was used to reverence from lawyers and politicians. Recent years brought criticism. Reports of undisclosed luxury trips with wealthy donors. Questions about his wife's political activities creating conflicts. A growing sense he'd become too comfortable with power, too dismissive of oversight. Walking into today's hearing, Alito expected the usual political theater, deflecting tough questions with legal jargon, getting Republican softballs, then going home. At 43, Crockett represented everything changing in American politics. Born in St. Louis, she'd watched her community struggle with poverty and a justice system that failed people who looked like her. No political royalty. University of Missouri for business, Howard Law for civil rights training. Over a decade as a public defender and civil rights attorney in Dallas, taking cases others avoided, police brutality, voting rights, discrimination against powerful institutions. She won her congressional seat in 2022, promising to bring that fighting spirit to Washington. Her platform, judicial accountability, voting rights protection, criminal justice reform. This hearing represented a fundamental question. Should powerful institutions be above accountability? For months, reports raised questions about Supreme Court justices, including Alito. Luxury vacations paid by billionaire donors. Questionable real estate deals. The court's ethics rules were voluntary, with no enforcement. Progressive activists demanded stronger oversight. Conservative leaders argued these were politically motivated attacks. The American public watched, losing faith that justice was blind. For Crockett, this was a chance to speak for millions feeling the system was rigged. For Alito, an opportunity to defend judicial independence. The hearing room told this story. Democratic members sat armed with research folders, Republican members ready to defend against political grandstanding. In the gallery, young congressional staffers watched Crockett with hope. The questioning started routinely. Committee members asked Alito about ethics concerns, and he deflected with practiced ease. His responses were technically accurate but evasive, full of legal technicalities that obscured the issues. Republican members lobbed softball questions. Judge Alito, can you help us understand the difference between personal friendship and inappropriate relationships with donors? Certainly, Congressman, Alito replied smoothly. The key is whether there's any quid pro quo. In my case, these were simply long-standing friendships with no connection to pending cases. Democratic members pressed harder, but Alito knew how to run out the clock with long non-answers that sounded substantive but revealed nothing. As questioning moved down the roster, tension gradually increased. Some exchanges grew heated, with Republicans accusing Democrats of intimidating the judiciary, and Democrats accusing Republicans of enabling corruption. Alito remained largely unruffled, occasionally showing irritation when questions got pointed, but maintaining his judicial demeanor. He had prepared carefully, anticipating attacks and developing responses that sounded reasonable while avoiding real accountability. Then Crockett's time arrived. Judge Alito, she began calmly, I want to ask about something specific. Last year you took a luxury fishing trip to Alaska with a billionaire who has had cases before the court. You never disclosed this trip. Can you help me understand how this meets any reasonable definition of ethical behavior? Alito's response was swift and dismissive. Congresswoman, I'm not sure you understand how judicial ethics actually work. These disclosure requirements are complex. Actually, Your Honor, Crockett interrupted gently, I understand perfectly well how disclosure requirements work. I've been practicing law for 15 years. What I don't understand is how a Supreme Court justice thinks he's above basic ethical standards that apply to every other federal judge. The first crack appeared in Alito's composure. His eyes narrowed, and his voice took on a lecturing tone. Perhaps, Congresswoman, you should focus on making laws rather than telling judges how to interpret them. The separation of powers exists for a reason. Crockett didn't flinch. She opened a thick folder and pulled out a document. Judge Alito, I have the ethics opinion you wrote on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. You wrote, even the appearance of impropriety can undermine public confidence in the judiciary. Judges must avoid any situation that might reasonably call their impartiality into question. Do you remember writing that? Alito shifted uncomfortably. Congresswoman, context matters. The context, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength, is that you held yourself to a higher standard 20 years ago than today. The context is that you've taken hundreds of thousands in unreported gifts from people with business before the court. The context is that you think the rules don't apply to you. The room grew quieter. Committee members stopped shuffling papers. Staff turned from their phones to watch. Alito's response was sharp. I reject the premise of your question. I have followed all applicable ethics guidelines. Have you? Crockett shot back. Because according to federal ethics experts, you've violated disclosure requirements multiple times. According to watchdog groups, you've created conflicts that would disqualify any lower court judge. According to common sense, you've accepted gifts that create the appearance of corruption. This was when Alito made his crucial mistake. Instead of staying defensive, he went on the attack, his tone revealing condescension that had been building throughout the hearing. Congresswoman, he said, that smirk spreading across his face. I've been a judge longer than you've been a lawyer. I've served on the Supreme Court while you were still in law school. Perhaps you should focus on issues you actually understand, instead of grandstanding for the cameras. The words hung in the air like a slap. The smirk made it clear he thought he had delivered a devastating blow, putting this upstart congresswoman in her place. Republican members nodded approvingly. Conservative observers smiled. Alito leaned back, satisfied he had reasserted control. But he had badly misread both the room and his opponent. The reaction was immediate and electric. Democratic members straightened, some visibly angry at the dismissive tone. In the gallery, young staffers and civil rights observers exchanged glances. They had witnessed exactly the institutional arrogance that drove their activism. Crockett was perfectly still, absorbing what had happened. The cameras caught her expression, not anger, not hurt, but something more dangerous, complete focus. She looked like a lawyer who had just heard perjury and was calculating exactly how to destroy the witness. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, but there was steel in it. "Your Honor," she said, emphasizing the title like a challenge, "I think it's time we talked about what I actually understand." Everyone in the room knew something special was about to happen. Alito's smirk began to fade as he noticed the change in Crockett's demeanor. Republican members stopped looking confident. The gallery leaned forward. Jasmine Crockett was about to show Samuel Alito and the entire country exactly what she understood about power, accountability, and the true meaning of justice under law. The moment Crockett stood up, everything changed. The casual dismissal, the condescending smirk, the assumption that she could be intimidated, all of it had just backfired spectacularly. Alito had awakened something in her that he was completely unprepared to handle. "What I understand, Your Honor," Crockett began, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent chamber, "is that I've spent 15 years fighting for justice in courtrooms across Texas. What I understand is that I've won civil rights cases against police departments, school districts, and corporations that thought they were untouchable. What I understand is that I've never, not once, had to explain to a client why I was taking luxury vacations with the opposing party." She paused, letting that sink in, then continued. "What I understand is that when I was a public defender making $45,000 a year, I turned down a $500 gift card from a grateful client because I knew it would create a conflict of interest. What I understand is that the lawyers I worked with, good, ethical lawyers, wouldn't even accept lunch from someone who might appear in their courtroom." Alito tried to interrupt. "Congresswoman, these situations are not comparable." But Crockett was just getting started. "You're absolutely right, Your Honor. They're not comparable. Because when I violated ethics rules, I would have been disbarred. When you violate ethics rules, you give speeches about how the rules don't really apply to you." Crockett reached into her folder and pulled out a stack of documents. "Let's talk about what I understand about your record, Judge Alito. I understand that in 2008, you bought stock in a company just 3 months before you heard a case involving that company. I understand that you participated in cases involving companies where you owned stock at least 3 times that we know of." She held up another document. "I understand that you took a luxury fishing trip to Alaska worth over $100,000 with a billionaire whose foundation had cases before the court. I understand that you flew on private jets, stayed in luxury lodges, and never reported any of it." Alito's face was reddening. "Those are gross mischaracterizations." "I understand," Crockett continued, her voice getting stronger, "that your wife flew flags associated with the January 6th insurrection at your home, including flying the American flag upside down, while you were deciding cases related to that very insurrection." The room was electric now. Republican committee members were shifting uncomfortably. Democratic members were leaning forward, some of them struggling to hide their excitement at seeing someone finally land real blows on Alito. But Crockett wasn't done. She was about to make this personal in a way that would resonate with millions of Americans watching at home. "You want to know what else I understand, Your Honor? I understand what it's like to grow up in a community where people don't trust the justice system because they've seen too many examples of different rules for different people." Her voice took on a different quality now, less prosecutorial, more passionate. "I understand what it's like to explain to a client that justice is supposed to be blind, that the law is supposed to apply equally to everyone, while knowing that the people making those decisions at the highest level are playing by completely different rules." She stepped closer to the witness table. "I understand what it's like to tell young people in my district that if they work hard and follow the rules, they can achieve anything in America, while watching Supreme Court justices accept gifts that would get them fired from any other job in the country." Now Crockett shifted into what she did best, methodically dismantling an opponent with facts and logic. "You mentioned that I should focus on issues I understand. So let's talk about what I understand about judicial ethics law. Canon 2 of the Code of Conduct states that a judge shall avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety. Canon 4 requires disclosure of financial interests. Canon 5 prohibits political activity." She pulled out another document. "According to this analysis by legal ethics experts, and I understand legal ethics because I've been bound by them my entire career, You have violated each of these canons multiple times. Alito tried again to respond. These are politically motivated attacks. Politically motivated? Crockett's eyebrows shot up. Your Honor, with respect, accountability isn't political. Ethics isn't political. Following the same rules as everyone else isn't political. Something was happening in the gallery. What had started as polite attention was becoming something more engaged, more electric. Young congressional staffers were sitting up straighter. Civil rights observers were nodding along. Even some of the reporters were struggling to maintain their professional neutrality. Crockett sensed the momentum and pressed her advantage. You want to know what I really understand, Judge Alito? I understand that you've spent this entire hearing acting like congressional oversight is beneath you, like accountability is beneath you, like the American people's right to trust their judiciary is beneath you. Her voice was rising now, but controlled, powerful. I understand that you think your position makes you untouchable, but what you don't seem to understand is that in America, no one is above the law. This was when Crockett delivered the blow that would be replayed millions of times on social media and remembered for years to come. Judge Alito, you've spent decades on the bench, and in all that time you seem to have forgotten the most basic principle of American justice: equal justice under law. Not equal justice for some, justice for all. She paused, looking directly at him. You sit on the highest court in the land, making decisions that affect every American's life. You have more power than almost anyone in our government, and you think that power exempts you from basic ethical standards that apply to every other public servant in America. The room was completely silent now. Even Alito seemed stunned by the force and precision of her attack. But here's what I understand that you don't seem to. Power without accountability isn't justice. It's tyranny. And the American people, the people I represent, the people you serve, deserve better. When Alito finally tried to respond, his usual confidence was completely gone. The smirk had disappeared, replaced by visible anger and frustration. Congresswoman, these attacks on judicial independence. This isn't an attack on judicial independence, Crockett shot back immediately. This is a defense of judicial integrity. Independence doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want without consequences. It means you get to make legal decisions without political interference. It doesn't mean you get to take bribes. I have never taken bribes, Alito snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. Then what would you call accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in gifts from people with business before your court? Crockett replied calmly. That was the moment it happened. Someone in the gallery, a young civil rights lawyer who had driven down from Baltimore to watch the hearing, stood up and started clapping. Within seconds, others joined in. Young congressional staffers, legal observers, even some reporters couldn't help themselves. The applause started scattered but quickly grew into something powerful and sustained. Democratic committee members were grinning and some began to clap as well. The Republican members looked stunned, unsure how to respond to this breach of hearing room protocol. Crockett stood there, still focused on Alito, but clearly aware of what was happening behind her. She had just articulated what millions of Americans had been feeling but couldn't put into words. She had taken on one of the most powerful people in America and made him look exactly like what he was, an out-of-touch elite who thought the rules didn't apply to him. The committee chairman gavelled for order, but it took nearly a minute for the applause to die down. When it finally did, Alito looked shaken. The confident jurist who had walked into the hearing room that morning was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he had just been exposed under harsh lights. When order was finally restored, Crockett wasn't finished. Judge Alito, I have one final question for you. When you go home tonight, are you going to think about the young lawyers watching this hearing who are struggling to build ethical practices while following rules that you seem to think don't apply to you? Are you going to think about the Americans who have lost faith in our justice system because they see different standards for different people? She paused, looking directly at him. Or are you going to think about how to attack the messengers instead of addressing the message? Alito sat in silence for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and defensive. I believe I have served the court and the country with integrity. Then prove it, Crockett said simply. Follow the same ethics rules as every other federal judge. Disclose your gifts. Recuse yourself when you have conflicts. Show the American people that justice really is equal under law. The hearing room was dead silent. Alito had no response. The most powerful judge in America had just been lectured on ethics by a first-term Congresswoman, and everyone in the room knew she had won. The moment Congresswoman Crockett finished her questioning and sat down, it was clear that something historic had just happened. The hearing room buzzed with an electric energy that veteran congressional observers hadn't felt in years. Reporters were frantically typing on their phones. Staff members were exchanging excited glances. Even the court reporters seemed energized by what they had just witnessed. Within minutes of the exchange ending, social media exploded with clips, commentary, and reactions. The hashtag Crockett versus Alito began trending on Twitter within 30 minutes. The video of her standing ovation hit over 100,000 views in the first hour. Progressive activists shared clips with captions like, "This is what accountability looks like," and, "Finally, someone said what we've all been thinking." Conservative commentators tried to frame it as disrespectful grandstanding, but even some Republican observers had to admit that Crockett had come prepared and delivered her points effectively. Young lawyers across the country shared the clip with messages about how inspiring it was to see someone their age take on the legal establishment. Law students in constitutional law classes watched it in real time and discussed it in study groups that evening. By the end of the day, videos of Crockett's confrontation with Alito had been viewed over 2 million times across various platforms. News organizations scrambled to book her for interviews. Her congressional office was flooded with calls from constituents expressing support. The most shared clip was a 2-minute segment that started with Alito's condescending, "Perhaps you should focus on issues you actually understand" comment, and ended with Crockett's, "Power without accountability isn't justice, it's tyranny" response. The visual contrast was striking. Alito's smirk transforming into visible discomfort while Crockett grew more confident and commanding. Legal ethics professors found themselves fielding calls from reporters asking them to analyze the exchange. Professor Sarah Martinez from Georgetown Law School told one news program, "Congresswoman Crockett did something remarkable. She took complex legal ethics issues and made them accessible to ordinary Americans. More importantly, she demonstrated that expertise and preparation can overcome institutional power and arrogance." Constitutional law expert Dr. James Wilson from Howard University noted, "What we witnessed wasn't just good political theater, it was a master class in how to hold powerful institutions accountable." Crockett came armed with facts, legal precedent, and moral clarity. Alito came armed with assumptions about deference and respect that simply didn't hold up under scrutiny. Even some conservative legal commentators acknowledged the effectiveness of her approach, though they disagreed with her conclusions. "You may not like her politics," wrote one prominent conservative blogger, "but you have to respect her preparation and her ability to make her case." The exchange had immediate political ramifications. Democratic leadership quickly praised Crockett's performance and began booking her on talk shows and fundraising events. Progressive organizations saw an opportunity to build momentum for judicial ethics reform, using the viral moment to push for concrete legislative changes. Republican strategists found themselves in a difficult position. They couldn't defend Alito's dismissive tone without seeming elitist and out of touch. They couldn't attack Crockett's questions without seeming to oppose judicial accountability. Their best option was to try to change the subject, but the viral nature of the exchange made that nearly impossible. What happened in that hearing room was bigger than just one confrontation between two people. It represented a generational and cultural shift in how Americans think about power and accountability. For years, Supreme Court justices had operated with minimal oversight, protected by traditions of deference and respect that made serious scrutiny nearly impossible. The court's approval ratings had been declining as Americans learned more about justices' financial arrangements and political activities. But no one had found an effective way to challenge the institution. Crockett's approach, combining legal expertise with moral clarity and accessible language, provided a template for how to hold powerful institutions accountable in the social media age. She didn't just criticize Alito, she exposed the fundamental contradiction between the court's power and its lack of accountability. The viral moment gave new energy to efforts to strengthen judicial ethics rules. Reform advocates used clips from the hearing in their advocacy materials. congressional Democrats introduced new legislation requiring disclosure of gifts and establishing enforcement mechanisms for ethics violations. Public opinion polling conducted in the weeks following the hearing showed increased support for judicial ethics reform, particularly among younger Americans who had watched the exchange on social media. The visual of a young, diverse Congresswoman schooling an older, white male judge on ethics resonated with Americans who felt like their institutions weren't representing their values. For Jasmine Crockett, personally, the moment transformed her from a first-term Congresswoman into a national political figure. Speaking requests poured in from universities, legal organizations, and political groups. Her fundraising numbers spiked as small-dollar donors around the country sent contributions. But perhaps more importantly, she had proven that it was possible to challenge institutional power effectively. Young politicians, particularly women and people of color, saw her performance as evidence that they didn't have to accept condescending treatment from established figures. In interviews following the hearing, Crockett was thoughtful about the attention. "This was never about me," she told one reporter. "This was about holding powerful people accountable to the same standards as everyone else." The fact that it went viral just shows how hungry Americans are for that kind of accountability. Judge Alito, for his part, largely retreated from public view following the hearing. His office issued a brief statement reaffirming his commitment to judicial ethics, but he declined interview requests and avoided public appearances for several weeks. Legal observers noted that his subsequent judicial opinions and public statements seemed more careful, as if he was aware that his every word would be scrutinized more closely. Some saw this as evidence that accountability efforts could be effective. Others worried about the impact on judicial independence. The exchange also raised deeper questions about the relationship between the judicial and legislative branches of government. Constitutional law professors debated whether aggressive congressional oversight of judges could undermine judicial independence or whether such oversight was necessary to maintain public confidence in the courts. "The Constitution establishes 3 co-equal branches of government," noted one legal scholar. "That means Congress has not just the right, but the responsibility to ensure that the judicial branch operates with integrity." What Congresswoman Crockett did was exercise that constitutional responsibility effectively. Beyond the immediate political and legal implications, the moment had a broader cultural impact. It became a symbol of how younger, more diverse leaders were willing to challenge institutional norms that previous generations had accepted without question. The exchange was discussed in law schools, political science classes, and civics courses as an example of effective advocacy and democratic accountability. Young people who had grown up feeling disconnected from traditional political institutions saw Crockett's performance as evidence that the system could be changed from within. Perhaps most importantly, the confrontation demonstrated several crucial lessons for American democracy. First, that preparation and expertise could overcome institutional advantages. Crockett succeeded not because she was louder or more aggressive than Alito, but because she was better prepared and more knowledgeable about the specific issues at hand. Second, that accountability didn't require disrespect. Throughout the exchange, Crockett maintained a professional tone while delivering devastating critiques. She showed that it was possible to challenge power without abandoning dignity or decorum. Third, that ordinary Americans were hungry for leaders who would hold powerful institutions accountable. The viral nature of the exchange showed that there was a massive audience for this kind of principled confrontation. As the immediate attention from the hearing began to fade, the longer-term implications became clearer. Judicial ethics reform gained momentum in Congress. Other young politicians began adopting similar approaches to holding powerful figures accountable, and Americans had a new model for how democratic oversight could work in the social media age. The moment also established Jasmine Crockett as a rising star in progressive politics. Speaking invitations, media requests, and political opportunities continued to flow in. But more importantly, she had proven that it was possible to challenge institutional power effectively while maintaining credibility and professionalism. For Judge Alito and the Supreme Court more broadly, the exchange served as a warning that the old assumptions about deference and respect could no longer be taken for granted. In an age of increased transparency and social media scrutiny, judicial figures would need to be more careful about their conduct and more responsive to legitimate oversight concerns. Months later, clips from the hearing were still being shared and discussed. Law schools used the exchange as a teaching tool. Political communications experts analyzed Crockett's techniques. And ordinary Americans continued to find inspiration in the moment when a young Congresswoman stood up to one of the most powerful people in the country and made him answer for his actions. The phrase, "power without accountability isn't justice, it's tyranny," became a rallying cry for reform movements across the political spectrum. T-shirts, bumper stickers, and social media profiles featured the quote, turning Crockett's words into a lasting symbol of democratic accountability. In the end, what happened in that hearing room represented something fundamental about American democracy. When institutions become too comfortable with power, when leaders start believing they're above accountability, democracy requires people brave enough to challenge them. Jasmine Crockett showed that such challenges could be effective when they were grounded in expertise, powered by moral clarity, and delivered with professional dignity. She proved that in America, no one, not even Supreme Court justices, should be above the basic requirement to explain their actions to the people they serve. The standing ovation she received wasn't just for her performance in that moment. It was for her willingness to speak truth to power, to demand accountability from institutions that had operated without meaningful oversight for too long, and to demonstrate that democracy works best when its leaders remember that they serve the people, not the other way around. If this story inspired you the way it inspired millions of Americans who watched it unfold, then you understand why moments like this matter so much for our democracy. When young leaders like Jasmine Crockett stand up to powerful institutions and demand accountability, they're not just making political points, they're defending the principle that made America great, that no one is above the law. This confrontation between Crockett and Alito will be remembered as a turning point, the moment when a new generation of leaders showed they weren't afraid to challenge the old guard and demand better from our institutions. It proved that with preparation, courage, and moral clarity, anyone can hold the most powerful people in America accountable. But moments like this only matter if we pay attention to them, share them, and support the leaders who have the courage to create them. That's why it's so important that you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because democracy works best when we're all paying attention to the people fighting for accountability and justice. The next time someone tells you that young people don't understand how the system works, or that new leaders should defer to institutional power, remember this moment. Remember how Jasmine Crockett walked into that hearing room armed with facts, legal precedent, and moral conviction, and walked out having delivered one of the most powerful defenses of democratic accountability in recent memory. And remember that in America, when our leaders forget that they serve us and not the other way around, we have the power to remind them. Whether it's through elections, oversight hearings, or simply demanding better from the people who represent us, we can hold power accountable. The standing ovation that echoed through that hearing room wasn't just for one Congresswoman's performance. It was for the idea that democracy still works, that accountability is still possible, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the right person asking the right questions at the right moment can change everything. So subscribe, share this story, and stay engaged. Because the next time someone needs to stand up to power and demand accountability, it might just be you. And when that moment comes, you'll know exactly what real courage and preparation can accomplish. The fight for accountability and justice never ends. But moments like this remind us why it's always worth fighting for.